Margaret Harrison adjusted her lace curtains for the third time that morning, peering out at the pristine suburban street where she'd lived for 43 years. At 72, she maintained her two-story colonial home with the same rigid precision that had governed her entire life. Everything had its place. Everyone had their role, and certain lines were never crossed. "Margaret, you're going to wear holes in those curtains," her neighbor Dorothy called from the adjacent yard. Both women embodied the genteel racism of their generation, polite, subtle, but unmistakably present in every interaction. "I'm just concerned about property values," Margaret replied, smoothing her silver hair. "The Johnsons moved in last month, and now there's that landscaping truck parked outside every Tuesday." Dorothy nodded knowingly. "Well, at least they're keeping up appearances. Though I do worry about what comes next." Margaret's immaculate living room reflected decades of careful curation, antique furniture, family portraits spanning generations of white faces, and fresh flowers arranged with military precision. She'd built this life methodically, marrying young to Thomas Harrison, raising two children who now lived across the country, and maintaining the social standing that came with being a doctor's widow. The doorbell's chime interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw a young black man in work clothes, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm Jerome Washington from Green Valley Landscaping. The Johnsons referred me, said you might need lawn service." Margaret hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. "I usually handle my own yard work." "Yes, ma'am, but they mentioned you've been having some trouble with the heavier tasks lately." The truth stung. At 72, Margaret could no longer manage the mowing, edging, and trimming that kept her yard immaculate. But hiring help meant admitting weakness and hiring. This particular help meant crossing social lines she'd never questioned. "Hello, my Stop Racism family. Thank you for tuning in today. Before we dive deeper into the story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country and state in the comments below. Also, I'd love to know your thoughts. What did you think of the story? So far, let us know in the comments. We love reading them, and trust me, your words motivate us to keep making these videos. Let's make this video reach at least 50 comments. Your support means the world to us, and it drives us to create even more meaningful content for you. So don't forget to comment, share, and keep the positivity flowing. Sunday afternoon brought Margaret's monthly bridge club, where 4 elderly white women gathered to play cards and reinforce their worldview over cucumber sandwiches and Earl Grey tea. I heard Margaret's considering hiring one of those landscaping services. Evelyn mentioned dealing the cards with practiced efficiency. "Which one?" asked Ruth, her voice already carrying judgment. "The one the Johnsons use. That black fellow with the truck." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I haven't decided anything yet." "Well, dear," said Barbara, her tone dripping with false concern, "you do need to be careful. These people seem nice enough, but you never know their real intentions. They see a widow living alone in a nice house." "Exactly," Ruth chimed in. "My sister hired one in Westchester, and within a month, half her garden tools had disappeared. They're just not raised with the same values we were." Margaret nodded along, the familiar chorus validating her instincts. These women had been her social circle for decades, their opinions carrying the weight of shared experience and class solidarity. "Thomas always said you can judge a person's character by how they maintain their property," Margaret added, invoking her late husband's memory. "He worked hard to give us this life. I won't let anyone take advantage of that." The afternoon continued, with familiar refrains about declining neighborhoods, changing demographics, and the importance of maintaining standards. Each woman contributed stories that reinforced their collective belief that certain people simply couldn't be trusted, that social boundaries existed for good reason. As they departed, Barbara squeezed Margaret's hand. "Just remember, dear, kindness is a virtue, but wisdom is a necessity." Tuesday morning found Margaret at the local grocery store, navigating the produce section with her usual efficiency. She prided herself on knowing exactly which vegetables were freshest, which checkout clerks were most competent, and which aisles to avoid during certain hours at the pharmacy counter. She waited behind a young black woman struggling with insurance paperwork for her prescription. "Ma'am, "I'm sorry, but your coverage doesn't extend to this medication," the pharmacist explained patiently. "But my baby needs this," the woman said, her voice strained with worry. The doctor said it was important. Margaret shifted impatiently, checking her watch with obvious irritation. "Excuse me," she said loudly, "but some of us have appointments to keep." The young mother turned, embarrassment flushing her dark skin. "I'm sorry, I'll just be another minute. Perhaps you should have sorted this out before coming in," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to deference. "The rest of us shouldn't have to wait because you can't manage your affairs properly." Other customers in line looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. The pharmacist tried to mediate, but Margaret had made her point she belonged here, and others didn't. When the young woman finally left empty-handed, Margaret stepped forward with satisfaction. "Now then, I need my blood pressure medication refilled." As she drove home through tree-lined streets where American flags flew from perfectly maintained porches, Margaret felt the comfortable certainty of her position in the social order. Some people belonged in certain places, and others didn't. It was simply the natural way of things. Thursday afternoon brought Jerome Washington to Margaret's front door again. It's time with a formal estimate for lawn care services. Despite her reservations, practical necessity had won out. The yard was becoming unmanageable, and neighborhood standards demanded perfection. "Mrs. Harrison, I've prepared a comprehensive service plan," Jerome said, his professional demeanor impeccable. "Weekly mowing, bi-weekly edging, seasonal fertilization, and fall cleanup." Margaret studied the paperwork through the screen door, unwilling to invite him inside. "This seems expensive." "The price reflects quality service, ma'am. I guarantee your lawn will be the best on the block." Something in his voice made her really look at him for the first time. Jerome was tall and lean, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. There was something familiar about his profile, something that tugged at a memory she couldn't quite place. "You can start next week," she heard herself saying, surprising them both. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. You won't regret this decision." As he walked back to his truck, Margaret caught herself watching through the window. Something about the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, stirred a recognition she couldn't name. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling as foolishness. But that night, she found herself digging through old photo albums, searching for something she couldn't identify. In a box from her college years, she found what she was looking for: a picture of herself at 20, laughing beside a young man whose face held the same gentle strength she'd seen in Jerome's features. Michael Chen had been her secret during junior year, the brilliant pre-med student she'd loved desperately but could never bring home to meet her parents. He wasn't black, but he wasn't white either, and in 1969, that had been enough to end their relationship when social pressure became too great. Jerome's first day of work shattered Margaret's expectations completely. She watched from her kitchen window as he methodically transformed her overgrown lawn into a masterpiece. He worked with the same careful precision she applied to her home's interior, treating each blade of grass with respect. When he finished, he knocked on her door to present his work. "What do you think, Mrs. Harrison?" Margaret stepped onto her front porch, genuinely amazed. The lawn looked better than it had in years, as a sharp grass, evenly cut, flower beds perfectly defined. It's beautiful. "Thank you, ma'am. I take pride in my work." As he packed his equipment, Margaret found herself asking, "Where did you learn to do this?" "My grandfather taught me," Jerome replied, his face lighting up. "He was a groundskeeper at the country club for 40 years. Said a man's work is a reflection of his character." The words echoed something Thomas used to say, and Margaret felt an uncomfortable shift in her certainty. Here was someone who clearly shared her values about quality and pride, yet everything she'd been taught suggested he shouldn't. That evening, Dorothy commented on the yard's transformation. "I have to admit, it looks wonderful, though I still think you should be careful about getting too comfortable with them." Margaret nodded absently, but doubt had taken root. Jerome's work spoke louder than her neighbor's warnings. The following week brought unseasonably heavy rain, flooding several basements in the neighborhood. Margaret watched from her window as Jerome arrived for his scheduled appointment. Despite the weather making yard work impossible, instead of leaving, he knocked on her door. "Mrs. Harrison, I can't do the lawn today, but I noticed your gutters are overflowing. Mind if I take a look?" Before she could answer, he was up on a ladder, clearing debris from her gutters with the same care he showed her lawn. When he climbed down, soaked and muddy, he refused her offer of payment. "This wasn't part of our agreement," he said simply. "Just being neighborly." Later that afternoon, Margaret saw him helping the elderly Mr. Peterson across the street, whose basement had flooded. Jerome spent 3 hours pumping water and moving damaged belongings, again refusing payment. That evening, her daughter Carol called from California. "Mom, the Petersons called me. They're worried about you hiring a black man for yard work. They think you're being naive." "The Petersons' basement flooded today," Margaret said quietly. Jerome spent his afternoon helping them clean up for free. "Well, that's nice, I suppose. But Mom, you need to be realistic about people's motivations." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her living room, surrounded by 40 years of accumulated certainty. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every carefully chosen decoration reflected a life built on clear social boundaries. But Jerome's actions challenged those boundaries in ways she couldn't dismiss. She thought again of Michael Chen, of the love she'd sacrificed to maintain those very boundaries. The memory carried new weight now, new questions about the price of her choices. Margaret's Bridge Club convened the following Sunday with unusual urgency. Word had spread about her lawn service, and concerns needed to be addressed. "Dear, we're worried about you," Barbara began carefully. "This whole arrangement with that black man seems to be getting out of hand." "What do you mean?" "Well," Ruth chimed in, "people are talking. They say he's been hanging around your house, doing extra work without being asked. It just doesn't look right." Margaret felt a familiar pressure to conform, to maintain her standing within the group that had defined her social identity for decades. "And, frankly," Evelyn added, "at our age, we can't afford to be naive. These people are different from us. They don't have the same moral foundation." "Jerome has been nothing but professional and helpful," Margaret said quietly. "That's exactly what we're worried about," Barbara replied. "They're very good at seeming trustworthy until they're not. Your husband would have never allowed this." The invocation of Thomas hit its mark. Margaret had spent 12 years as a widow maintaining the life they'd built together, honoring his memory through every decision. "Perhaps you should consider other options," Dorothy suggested. "There are plenty of wide-toned landscaping companies that would be more appropriate." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of their collective disapproval. These women had been her closest friends for decades. Their opinions had shaped her worldview, validated her choices, provided the social support that made widowhood bearable. But as they left that afternoon, Margaret found herself questioning whether friendship built on shared prejudice was truly friendship at all. The next Tuesday, Margaret waited on her front porch as Jerome arrived for his weekly service. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, but when he approached with his usual warm smile, the words stuck in her throat. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Mrs. Harrison?" Jerome said, unloading his equipment. "Jerome," she began hesitantly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Course, ma'am." Margaret struggled with how to frame her question without revealing her own prejudices. "Do you ever feel unwelcome in neighborhoods like this?" Jerome paused, studying her face carefully. "Are you asking if I experience racism, Mrs. Harrison?" The directness of his response caught her off guard. "Yes, I suppose I am. Every day," Jerome said simply. "But I've learned that people's initial reactions don't define them. How they grow does." They sat on her front steps in action. That would have scandalized her bridge club band. Jerome shared stories of his life. He'd graduated from community college with a business degree, started his landscaping company to support his aging grandmother, and dreamed of expanding into landscape design. "I could work for one of the big companies," he explained, "but I want to build something of my own. My grandfather taught me that dignity comes from honest work, regardless of what others think about it." Margaret found herself sharing memories she'd buried for decades, her college years, her brief rebellion against family expectations, the roads not taken. "I once knew someone," she said carefully, who was different from what my family expected. I let their disapproval end something that might have been beautiful. Jerome nodded knowingly. Fear makes us do things we regret later. Do you ever get angry about the way people treat you? Sometimes, Jerome admitted, but anger without action just eats you up inside. I'd rather prove people wrong through my work than waste energy being bitter. The crisis came on a sweltering July afternoon when Margaret collapsed while watering her garden. Jerome found her unconscious on the ground, her skin pale and clammy from heat exhaustion. Without hesitation, he carried her inside, called 911, and stayed with her until the ambulance arrived. At the hospital, Margaret's daughter Carol flew in from California, her face tight with worry and suspicion. The black man who called the ambulances, that the one you hired? Carol asked once Margaret was stable. Jerome saved my life, Margaret said weakly. Maybe, but we need to discuss your living situation. You clearly can't manage on your own anymore. Over the next few days, Carol made her intentions clear. Margaret needed to sell the house and move into assisted living. The yard service would be terminated immediately. I don't trust his motives, Carol explained. He's probably been planning this, getting close to a vulnerable widow so he could take advantage. Margaret felt a familiar pattern emerging her. Agency being stripped away by people who claimed to know what was best for her. It was the same pressure she'd felt at 21 when her parents ended her relationship with Michael. When Jerome came to check on her after her hospital release, Carol intercepted him at the door. My mother won't be needing your services anymore, she said coldly. Send a final bill. From her bedroom window, Margaret watched Jerome's face fall. He simply nodded and walked back to his truck, dignity intact despite the dismissal. That night, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. How's this story hitting you so far? Tell us in the comments. If you're loving it, type 1. If not, type 0. We want to know what you think. Margaret waited until Carol returned to California before calling Jerome. I want to apologize for my daughter's behavior, she said when he answered, and I want to ask you something important. They met at the small coffee shop downtown Neutral Territory, where Margaret felt brave enough to speak her truth. I'm 72 years old, she began, and I've spent most of my life being afraid of what other people think. I let that fear cost me love once before, and I won't let it cost me friendship now. Jerome listened as Margaret told him about Michael Chen, about the bridges she'd burned for social acceptance, about the loneliness that had defined her later years. I see something in you that reminds me of him, she continued, not physically, but in your character, your kindness, your strength. Mrs. Harrison, Margaret. Please call me Margaret. Margaret, you don't owe me any explanations. I understand family pressure, but I owe myself an explanation, she said firmly. I owe myself the chance to be better than I was. She offered Jerome a proposal that shocked them both, not just continued lawn service, but help expanding his business. Margaret had resources, connections, and decades of business experience through Thomas's medical practice. I want to invest in your landscape design dreams, she said. Not as charity, but as partnership. Jerome stared at her, overwhelmed by the unexpected offer. Why would you do this? Because 50 years ago, I chose fear over love. I won't make that mistake again. Margaret's transformation didn't happen quietly. When Carol discovered her mother's business partnership with Jerome, she threatened legal action to have Margaret declared incompetent. The confrontation came to a head during a family barbecue Carol organized, ostensibly to celebrate Margaret's recovery, but actually to stage an intervention with extended family members. Mothers clearly being manipulated, Carol announced to the assembled relatives. This black man has obviously identified her as an easy target. Margaret listened to 20 minutes of racist speculation about Jerome's motives before standing up in her own backyard. Enough, she said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone. I want all of you to listen very carefully. Family fell silent, shocked by her sudden assertiveness. Jerome Washington is my business partner and my friend. He has shown me more genuine care in 3 months than some of you have shown in 3 years. If you can't respect that, you're not welcome in my home. Carol's face reddened. You're being ridiculous. "This man is taking advantage of you. The only people taking advantage of me are the ones who think they can control my life because I'm old," Margaret replied firmly. "Jerome treats me like an intelligent adult, capable of making my own decisions." The barbecue ended with half the family leaving in outrage. Carol delivered an ultimatum in the partnership or lose her family's support. "Then, I guess I'll learn to live without support I never really had," Margaret said calmly. That evening, Margaret called Jerome to tell him about the confrontation. "Are you okay?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "I'm better than I've been in years," she replied honestly. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her backyard, admiring the landscape design Jerome had created. Not just functional beauty, but artistic vision that transformed her property into something remarkable. Local newspapers had featured the collaboration, bringing new clients to Jerome's expanding business. Jerome joined her on the patio, both of them admiring the garden that had become a symbol of unexpected partnership. "I keep thinking about that first day you came to my door," Margaret said, settling into her chair. "I was so determined to see you as a threat." "What changed your mind?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I realized that the threat wasn't you, it was becoming the kind of person who couldn't see your worth." Their friendship had deepened into something neither had expected, not romance, but genuine affection between two people who'd found each other across divides of race and generation. Jerome brought his grandmother to visit Margaret, and the three of them spent Sunday afternoons sharing stories and wisdom. "I lost touch with most of my family," Margaret continued, "but I gained something more valuable." "What's that?" she said simply. "For 50 years, I let other people's prejudices define my choices. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just building a prison." Jerome nodded, understanding the courage her transformation had required. "My grandfather used to say that the hardest ground to break is in your own heart." Through the window, Margaret could see the photo she'd moved to her mantelpiece. Another picture of Thomas, but the old college photograph of herself with Michael Chen. She'd finally honored that lost love by learning from its lesson. "Do you ever regret the business partnership?" Jerome asked. "Never," Margaret replied firmly. "It's the best investment I ever made, not financially, but personally." As evening settled over the garden they'd created together, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd lost the approval of people who'd never really known her, but gained the friendship of someone who saw her potential for growth. The lawn that had started as a simple business transaction had become the foundation for rebuilding her understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. At 72, Margaret Harrison had finally learned that love, whether romantic, familial, or friendship, wasn't about finding people who looked like you, but about recognizing the humanity in those who didn't. The black man mowing her lawn had indeed reminded her of someone she'd once loved, but not in the way she'd first imagined. He'd reminded her of the person she'd always had the potential to become.